So as we noted with the last slide, the Asian American as model minority image actually began in the 50s and 60s. It began with mainstream media depictions, and it was spurred actually by statistics indicating that, yeah, they are successful. Okay, so again, the statistics corresponding to the image. But we also left off with this idea that, hey, some subnationalities, or the word today we'd use is ethnic groups, began to resent that. Why? Because they were expected to just imitate Asians and their economic problems will be solved, right? Well, here we see a continuation in this New York Times article written by this commentator, op-ed commentator or writer named Nicholas Kristof. And the title of this is The Asian Advantage. I believe this was originally published in 2015 or so, but it's still relevant today. And he was writing a series of articles in the aftermath of the Ferguson riot and so forth. He's looking into race. And here's a quote that actually is based on one of his interviews from a quote, angry white. And this says, "This stuff about white privilege is nonsense. And if blacks lag, the reason lies in the black community itself. Just look at the Asian Americans, those Koreans and Chinese, make it in America because they work hard. All people can succeed here if they stop whining and start working." Okay, so here I'm introducing, or actually I'm continuing with this notion of model minority as being an ideological weapon. Okay, by the way, social researchers call this triangulation. All right, when you have three different groups, in this case ethnic groups or racial groups, and then one is used right in this if you will this tension between two groups, right? They use the third group. Well, here they are triangulated, right? Asian Americans are triangulated in the tension between whites and blacks. Okay, so here we could see not ethnic groups resenting the fact that Asian Americans are seen as model minorities, but in this case, the dominant group, the other side, the angry whites, saying, "Hey, all the blacks have to do is stop whining and start working like the Asian Americans do." Right. So, again, this is an example of how the Asian American model minority image is weaponized in our current discourse related to race, and it's still around today. Okay, now in the same article, when you go further down, you read further down, and this is the reason why I picked this article, by the way, because it shows, again, the weaponization of the minority image, but also down here. This is an interesting statement from the author, Christoph. He says, "Some disagree, but I'm pretty sure that one factor is East Asia's long Confucian emphasis on education, and that the factor for educational attainment, right? Likewise, a focus on education also helps explain the success of Jews, who are said to have had universal male literacy 1,700 years ago before any other group." Okay, so again, what accounts for the Asian advantage? Well, Christoph suggests, right, that he thinks Confucianism has a role to play. Now, he does, to his credit, cite East Asia, but we just looked at that breakdown of educational attainment based on different Asian American ethnic groups, right? Filipinos compared to South Asians, compared to Chinese, Japanese, Hmong, Laotian, and Cambodian. Now, he's citing Confucianism, which is cultural, right? That's a cultural dimension in the argument, not economic, not political, but cultural. Religion, right, is cultural. So he's saying here's a cultural factor that's influencing educational attainment, Confucianism, and its emphasis on education. But Christoph is ignoring or forgetting, perhaps, or just not even considering the fact that Asian Americans, if you're going to talk about the Asian American advantage, so to say, well, you have to account for all Asian groups. And here it's pretty glaring that even though he does say East Asia only accounts for one or two, well, maybe two or three groups of all those groups that we looked at in the previous graph. Okay, so what I'm saying here again is emphasize the fact that many mainstream commentators, and here this includes the op ed writer for the New York Times, they tend to think of Asian Americans, or they make a mistake, right, and think of Asian Americans as one group, forgetting that it's very much comprised of different ethnicities. There's different religions, right? Confucianism doesn't apply to, let's say, many Korean Americans today because many of them are Christian. It certainly doesn't apply to Filipinos. They are all Catholic because of Spanish colonialism. It doesn't apply to the Buddhists, many of them who are, let's say, Thai or Vietnamese, right? Um, um, it doesn't apply to Japanese, right? It's specific, or it's more specific to Chinese Americans, and that's just one group among, the more than a dozen that we saw earlier. Okay, so again, what I'm emphasizing here is how so many mistakes are being made by mainstream commentators, and not only that, not by also mainstream commentators, but even the quote angry white that I quoted earlier. Okay, so now we're gonna think about this when it comes to education. Is it really true that Asian Americans, by virtue of hard work and dedication and studying, that they'll do well, and all other groups should emulate Asian Americans? So we're going to look deeper into that. Now, it's important to note here that we're talking about Asian Americans. Okay, so we're talking about Asian immigrants and, of course, their generations after them once they settled, and their integration into the United States, right? Because, of course, they're Americans. So, one thing we have to talk about, in other words, is these persons of Asian descent, and you combine that with, in this case, the American school system, right? This American school system that, in principle, awards um, achievement and excellence to those who excel and work hard and study hard, and that are obviously naturally intelligent, right? Regardless of race or ethnicity, regardless of social class. So there's this notion that, the school system is neutral and objective, right? Now, this, by the way, brings us to the issue of assimilation, because we're talking about Asians assimilating into U.S. culture and particularly into the school system. So, what do we mean by assimilation according to social scientists? Well, this brings us to different theories about assimilation. One's older and, to be honest, considered more outdated. Okay, and the other one is questions the older, outmoded way. Okay, so the classical assimilation theory, again, this is the older way of looking at assimilation, I have to say it was really based on pre 1965 immigration. And when I say that, I'm basically referring to European immigration, right? Because as we know, there weren't a large number of Asians coming before 1965. So when you think about classical assimilation theory, and it's called classical for a reason because it's related to older times. Well, we're thinking about older European groups like Italians, Irish, Germans, Polish, and so forth, Jews, right? And in the classical assimilation theory that arose back then, this is before World War II, actually, when this theory gained currency, this is the view that immigrants integrate culturally and socially into the larger dominant culture in society, in this case, of course, United States. And what happens is the eventual erosion, eventual dissipation or disappearing of their pre-migration cultures and pre-migration attitudes and worldviews and outlooks. In other words, those, say, Italian outlooks, Italian cultural aspects, or Irish, or what have you, eventually begins to erode, disappear. What happens instead? Well, and this, according to classical assimilation theory, applies generationally, right? Eventually, they experience or they become more American, more assimilation, and as a result, they experience less racial discrimination once they achieve full assimilation, right? Now, one way of thinking about this is a way that a famous sociologist named Robert Park described it in 4 words. And here he's describing the assimilation process for immigrants. There's initial contact, meaning they come here from their place of origin, and then they make contact with the dominant society, right? And then there's competition, right, just to make a living, for work and all that stuff. And then eventual acculturation, meaning um, they become more attuned to American culture, acclimated to it, begin to adapt it, right, while discarding parts of their original culture of their homeland. And eventually you have full scale assimilation. Okay, so contact, competition, acculturation, assimilation. Now, that applies specifically to, the big picture of assimilation. Now, you can break it up into even assimilation theory in the world of education. Okay, now when we think about this, for example, you're taking a student and you're putting him or her through the educational system in the United States, right? The theory of assimilation sees education or schooling in general as a process of assimilation. In other words, a process of persons becoming more American in this case, because we're talking about, U.S. society, right? They're assimilated to American society. Schooling, in other words, is an aspect in the creation of a common culture, a common, quote, American culture. Okay, so with assimilation theory, when it comes to schooling combined with immigration, you can see how the last statement here applies. Immigrants integrating to the educational system leads to assimilation in the dominant society, in U.S. society. And therefore, you see in the process the loss of their pre-migration beliefs, culture, outlooks, and they become more Americanized. So the question we will try to address is, does this apply to post-1965 Asian Americans, and does this account for their success in the United States?